agreeing to be interviewed.
It's a pleasure and an honor.
Dick, how did you decide to be a lawyer?
You know, it was kind of by default. It was about the time that the Vietnam War was starting to heat up, and I wanted to stay in school a little bit longer, and law school seemed to be the natural thing. My father was a lawyer.
Where did he practice?
He practiced in Austin. He didn't do any criminal law. He did a lot of politics, behind-the-scene politics, and he was also involved in railroad commission work, oil and gas law. But politics was his real love. And he started me out, taking me everywhere he went.
And that's how you got interested in the law or thinking about it? Or
particularly government and how government impacts people. And then one of my favorite classes in high school was civics. And, you know, what we do is based on the Constitution. And you learn the Constitution and the form of government in high school, and I was fascinated by that.
Did you and your dad talk about the Constitution and
Not so much the Constitution as government and how government and the courts impact everyday lives. My dad was a Lyndon Johnson man from the very beginning, from the moment he got out of law school. And he and John Conley were roommates in college.
Okay.
And so I grew up with my dad taking me to backyard barbecues with John Conley and Lyndon Johnson and others of that ilk sitting around when I was 3 and 4 years old.
Wow. Those must be fantastic memories to have, but you've taken a position in your life fighting the government.
Well, of course.
Where does that come from?
Well, you know, you don't have to agree with the people that are governing you to agree with government and the courts and the laws. You know, what we do is we enforce the laws that are written for individuals. We enforce the Bill of Rights. That was written for individuals. You know, we wouldn't have this country but for the Bill of Rights. The Constitution would not have been approved by the various states unless the Bill of Rights had been appended to it. Once the Bill of Rights got appended to it, then the Constitution was approved.
So you got out of law school and you...
Got out of law school and tried to find a job, and the one that hired me was Frank Briscoe in the DA's office in Harris County.
How long did that last?
Well, it lasted 3 years, and it went into Carol Vance's administration. Frank Briscoe at that time was a statewide politician. He had great promise, but he chose the wrong time to resign from the DA's office and run for Congress because his opponent was the real George Bush, and Bush whipped him, and he never ran for public office again. But Briscoe was a dynamic guy, and
I knew later on in his life.
Well, he was a great prosecutor, and prosecuted some tough cases, and got a name for himself, and tried to bank on that name.
How big of an office was it back then?
I think we had about 40 lawyers, and we were on one floor of the old criminal courthouse at 301 San Jacinto in Houston. We'd have 3 lawyers in one office and a secretary, and it was pretty crowded, but it was great. A lot of camaraderie. And the thing that did for us was we all got to share ideas and what works and what doesn't work. I've always advocated a young lawyer to go with the district attorney's office because you learn so much about the court system. Whether you go into civil law or criminal law, doesn't matter. You learn how the courts work. You
left the DA's office and you hooked up with Percy. How did that come about?
Well, there was a little part in between. I went with a civil law firm thinking I wanted to be some civil lawyer, blue carpet guy.
I can't picture you in a big firm.
Neither could I, and neither could they. It didn't fit real well. But I did get some great experience. I had a great mentor there, Frank Knapp, a terrific trial lawyer. But it was right at the time of the Gideon versus Wainwright. And so the bar was in a panic. All these civil lawyers were going to be appointed to criminal cases. They didn't know what in the world to do. Most of them didn't know how to find the courthouse. So with me being the new guy from the DA's office with Butler and Bennion, all the partners that got appointed came to me to handle their cases. And so I kept my hand in the criminal law, and at the same time tried some fun cases.
And then where'd Percy come into all this?
Well, toward the end of my term at Butler and Bennion, a friend of mine, Bob Tarrant, fine lawyer, got in some trouble. And he was also a friend of Percy's. He had a collection of shotguns that weren't exactly registered. And so Percy volunteered to help him. I volunteered to help him, and we were just kind of thrown together preparing the case. And I remember Percy coming over to my office at Butler and Bennion and sitting there, and I had it briefed up. I really had some motions, and I thought we were going to kill him on the motions. Well, as most lawyers know, the motions are just preliminary things. But I guess he got impressed with me. They asked me to sit with him in the trial, and I didn't ask my superiors at Butler and Bennion because I was afraid they'd say no. So I just did it, and we sat through a 2-week trial in front of Judge Jim Noel.
Okay.
And won almost every count on a theory of entrapment. And during the trial, Percy kept looking back at me, and I thought, well, am I doing okay, and so forth. About halfway through the trial, he said, would you rather represent people instead of insurance companies? I said, well, sure. And by that time, I had my fill of insurance adjusters and claims managers and all these people looking over your shoulder. And I thought maybe if I left Butler Bennion, he'd just throw some cases to me. But after the case was over, he called me to his office. He says, I want you to go to work for me. I said, well, I don't know, Mr. Foreman. I've got this kind of on a partnership track at Butler and Bennion, and I'll have to think it over. He said, okay. I actually didn't give him an answer. I went back and talked to Jack Bennion, who was another one of my mentors there. He said, I got about halfway through the sentence. Percy Foreman has asked me to go to work for him. And I started to ask him whether I should. He said, God damn it, if you don't do it, you're a fool. And so I went to work for Percy.
What year was that?
That was in 1971.
Tell me about Percy. Describe Percy.
Percy,
because people. I had the privilege of meeting him, and I worked with him on a case with co-defendants once, and I cherished that being able to talk to him.
Yeah.
But describe him for.
Well, first, physically, he was imposing. He was 6'5". He weighed 300 pounds. At his peak, it was 300 pounds of muscle. He was a wrestler in high school and college. He grew up in Polk County, Texas. His father was sheriff. He went on the Chautauqua circuit when he was in college. The Chautauqua circuit was around in all the small communities. There would be a traveling troupe of entertainers on the Chautauqua circuit. And Percy's entertainment was he'd make speeches. He could speak about anything. But they were fabulous speeches. And
he had a wonderful voice.
Yeah. Well, he had a deep, booming voice. He had silver slick-back hair and a big beak of a nose, Indian features. I think he had some Indian blood in him.
He always
massive head.
And he always wore a hat.
He always wore a hat. And his hat size was 7 7/8. That's almost an 8. That's unheard of. But he was more than that. He was brilliant. He was a genius. He had a photographic memory. His real strength was he could size up people in a heartbeat, and that served him well. Not only with jury panels. He was wonderful with jury panels. He'd walk into a room, all eyes would be on him, no matter what they thought about him. And he had them in the palm of his hand after a while. But it's also important with witnesses and cops and judges and prosecutors and in every aspect of what we do. Being able to analyze people is an extremely important talent.
How did Percy influence you? You were with him for about 10 or 12 years.
12 years.
And
12 long years.
Oh, I can imagine. I've heard some of the stories, but how did he influence you as a person and as a lawyer?
By example and by just talking to me. He knew everything, I think. I constantly draw on that experience. I ought to wear a little wristband that says, "What would Percy do?" He would tell me in a sentence or two how to handle a case, and he'd be right. He's very seldom wrong. He used to say, I thought I was always right, but I found out I was wrong. When I thought I was wrong, I was actually right. His influence, but more importantly than just showing me the ropes, was his attitude. And his attitude was he fought for his client, no matter who it was, no matter what they were accused of. He didn't accept the story that the police told. He didn't accept what the file said. And so many lawyers nowadays are handed an offense report and they think that, well, that's the gospel. And they go in and and their first effort is to try to talk the client into pleading guilty. Percy said, if you're going to be a guilty plea lawyer, you don't need to know how to try cases.
Is that why you, for a long time, you wouldn't represent snitches, and you probably still don't?
I still don't represent snitches. That's basically being an agent for the government. And, it's getting more and more difficult to have that as a policy. But I've stuck with it.
Is that coming from Percy, your father, or a combination?
Came from Percy. My father taught me honesty. He was, whatever anybody ever said about him, two things. He was very, very smart. He was very, very honest. If he gave you your word, you could rely on it. Percy was the same way. He had a reputation of being a slick lawyer, but he was an honest guy. But what Percy taught was an attitude, and that attitude is fight. I was talking to some young lawyers last night at Jerry Goldstein's party, and they were asking me about stuff like that. I said, look, all you need to do is fight. This guy said, well, I just get appointed cases. I don't know what, all I know to do is go in and plead. Well, take the appointed case and ask the guy, don't you want a trial? Don't you want to go to trial? Then we might be able to win this case. You don't have to talk the client into it, but you build a little spirit. So many of the appointed cases, the client is lost. They feel hopeless, and they think, well, I've been appointed a warm body to sit next to me. And so I tell my students in law school, I told these guys last night, don't be just that warm body. Get in there and fight. Go to the scene. Find out the facts. Find out something about your opponent and the witnesses, and try the case. It served me well. Percy instilled that fighting spirit in me. At one time he was interviewed. He was asked about me. He said, well, I'll tell you. He says, courage is more important than brains. And I thought, gosh, and then wait a minute, what does he say there?
That's something that young lawyers don't understand, their role. And
I think that's right. And it is frightening to go in front of a jury and a judge. Usually the judges nowadays are very prosecution-minded because that's how they get reelected. But and the police, and you've got so many things lined up against you, and so it takes courage to get up there and fight. I still get nervous before every trial.
If you don't, I always think if you aren't nervous, you need to quit.
And you need to channel that nervous energy into a fighting spirit.
Your brother is very different from you.
Yes and no. Mike has a fighting spirit.
Oh, definitely a fighting spirit, but his approach is different.
It is. Mike was always the diplomat in the family. And I would always go up and stick somebody in the eye with a sharp stick.
I thought it was a 2x4 over the back of the head.
Well, that'll work too. Now, my dad taught me, I grew up small, and I was a year and a half to 2 years younger than everybody else in my grade, so I got picked on a bunch. So I hate bullies. And I asked my dad once, I came home and this guy was bullying me, and he said, you go right back there and you go up to that guy and punch him in the nose. And I said, you sure? He said, yeah. Just go do it. So I did, and beat the compound hell out of me. But he never tried it again, because I got a good blow in.
You know, Dick, you've been a lawyer now for 40 years?
Well, since 1965, yeah.
45 years. Mm-hmm. And I know when I moved to Houston, the first thing I did was pick up blood and money.
Yeah.
And I stick DeGuerin all over it.
Yeah.
Was that your first really big?
That was my second big publicity case.
What was your first one?
I defended Percy for driving DWI.
Is that where the grandfather clause? Or?
Yeah. He'd never had a driver's license, and he said, I don't need one. I've been grandfathered in. They invented driver's licenses long after I started to drive. Yeah, I lost that case, but I learned a lot from it, because everywhere I went in the courthouse, they were sticking a microphone in front of me, and some of my remarks were not on point, and I learned the value of trying to get a quick, succinct position in the press to counteract what the state and the cops have already done. I think it's absolutely valid, and you ought to do it, and it's ethical. But that was, the blood and money case was a huge deal.
Yeah. Now, who did you represent?
I represented Lila Paulus.
And who was she?
She was supposedly the madam. She wasn't really a madam. She owned some rental property on Post Office Street in Galveston. She was supposedly the go-between between Ash Robinson, who was Joan Robinson Hill's father, and believed that John Hill had murdered her, and the killers. There was one guy.
The killers of John Hill.
The killers of John Hill. John Hill and his new wife were coming home from a medical convention in Las Vegas, and he was met at the door by the killer, who had already broken in and had tied up his son and his wife's mother, and the guy shot him and ran off, threw the gun away, and eventually the gun was found. But that guy, the killer, was eventually killed by a police officer. He never came to trial. There was a woman named Marcia McKittrick, a prostitute from Dallas, who arranged for her boyfriend to do the killing. The question is whether Ash Robinson commissioned Lila Paulus to do it, and whether Lila actually commissioned the killers to do it. I still believe we got the short end of that stick. The Court of Criminal Appeals, a panel of the Court of Criminal Appeals reversed it for insufficient evidence. And then the whole court came back and reversed the reversal.
So that's 1975, 76?
73 or 4, yeah.
And your career started growing from that point.
Well, you know, there are those of us that have high-profile cases, and what you don't realize is that there's also bread and butter cases. There are many, many cases that I've handled that didn't get that kind of publicity, and you have to do it first to keep the money coming in, pay the bills. But the vast majority of us don't get the opportunity to have those big publicity cases. Don't get me wrong; it's great to do it because it's a real business getter.
Right.
Your name in the paper. Percy recognized the value of that early on.
I remember hearing one time a Percy quote saying, "The only thing wrong about having your name in the paper is if they misspell your name." Or
he said it doesn't matter whether they misspell your name or not, as long as it's in the paper. Yeah, he in the Houston Press, which is out of business, really kind of made him. Percy used to get angry at me because I started getting my own publicity, and yet it was the same thing that he did. Not long after I left Percy, I tried a case up in East Texas, and it was a huge publicity.
Which one?
It was the Fontenot murder case. He
Right.
was accused of killing. He's a black man who was a principal of a junior high school, accused of killing the white coach in a love triangle over the secretary. And it was tried in East Texas. So you can imagine how the cards were stacked against us. That was in 1986, and it was still, and there still is a lot of racial prejudice up in East Texas. But it had gotten so much publicity. We had 100-member venari, and the judge asked the question, how many of you have heard anything about this case? Every hand went up, except a woman on the front row. And the judge was curious, so she said, well, now, ma'am, have you heard anything about this case? She said, no, I have heard nothing except it was a love triangle. So we did basically individual voir dire with that panel.
You you had the first big dope boat case in Galveston.
Yeah, the Texas Star.
And that was a big case in South Texas.
It was. I got the call. These four guys were on board the Texas Star, converted shrimp boat. And I got the call from the Coast Guard that they wanted to talk to me, a lawyer. So I got on the phone. They're still out. The Coast Guard's bringing them in. They're still out on the Gulf. And I said, don't say anything. I'll meet you at the dock. So I went down to the dock, and there was a bunch of publicity and a bunch of things there. And I had binoculars. I'm looking out there to watch the ship come in. Percy had a way of often getting to the crime scene before the cops did.
Yeah. And being there when the cops arrived.
One case in particular, the woman called Percy first after she killed her husband.
Is that the one that Dan Rather did the...
Yeah, the CBS News did.
Right.
Yeah, and they filmed the whole trial. Gus George, who was
right.
chief deputy at that time, was hated Percy. And the cross-examination of Gus George by Percy is a classic. He used that hatred that Gus George had for Percy to destroy Gus George.
I've seen bits and pieces of that video. Someday I want to see the whole thing.
It's great. But the point was, she called Percy, and Percy, I just shot my husband, what'd I do? He said, shut up, honey, I'll be there. And he gets over there somewhere out in Memorial, and he calls the police. And when police get to the place, and he opens the door for them. Come on in, boys.
You're going through the 80s, and in the 90s you were at the Branch Davidian.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, I got the call from David Korsh's mother. She didn't know what to do. Except for the scale of it, it's the same thing that happens to us all the time. Some relative of the accused will call. My son's hiding out in the woods, and they've surrounded him, or I know he's wanted, and so you have to take the case then on an emergency basis, and that's what I did. I went to Waco immediately. I had his mother with me because lots of other lawyers were trying to get in the case. She was my credentials,
right?
And I went out to the FBI and tried to get them to let me in, and they shunned or thumbed their noses at me, and so I filed a writ. As started acting like a lawyer, and eventually they saw that we had parallel interests, and I wanted a client in court,
right? And
they wanted the thing to end peacefully. So they thought I might be able to pull that off.
Tell me what you learned from that experience.
Gosh, it was more like I brought what I'd learned in the 30 years I'd been practicing before that to that experience. We learn every day, and if we don't, we're something wrong with us. We need to keep learning. And you learn more by your mistakes than you do by your successes. So I knew that I had to act like a lawyer. I also knew that the world was watching, and that I wanted to set an example that we as lawyers could be proud of. So I acted like a lawyer. I took the writ, by the way, to the federal courthouse, and I sat Bonnie Haldeman's mother in a bench on the second floor of Waco Federal Courthouse underneath this beautiful bronze plaque of the Bill of Rights. And she's sitting there, and I'd start to go into the clerk's office. I look down the hallway, and there's the judge, and he's rushing out of the courthouse so he won't have to talk to me. He was actually still in his robes, and he was rushing out of the courthouse. And there she is sitting under the Bill of Rights. I guess you learn from that. People are people, and that judge didn't want to be put in a position where he had to respect the Bill of Rights.
And then you went before Congress.
Yeah, Congress, and it had turned into a political battle. It was a real education to see how people, the Republicans, were the ones that were so concerned with the individual rights of the Davidians, and the Democrats, who are usually the civil libertarians, were the ones that were defending the jackbooted thugs. I was just topsy-turvy. But Jack Zimmerman and I stayed there all day. They were scheduled for an hour, and then we took up the whole day because it just became so fascinating. The congressman became so fascinated. And what I learned from that is that when a congressman who's antagonistic to you asks you a question, you should make your answer last the entire time that he has allotted to him, and then he doesn't get to ask a follow-up. But it was a real education.
I've watched you in trial many times. I sat next to you many times, and there's a great deal of passion in everything you do every day. Where does that come from?
You have to believe in what you're doing. That's the first thing. And I find that no matter who the client is, I can find something good about them. A lot of good people do bad things, and that doesn't make them bad people. So first, it's a desire to help someone who's helpless and in trouble. And I guess I got that from hating bullies so much. And secondly, it's believing in the strength of the laws, the rules of evidence, rules of procedure, the Constitution, and enforcing those laws. I find that very easy to do.
When we hear the name DeGuerin, what do you think that name stands for?
Well, I hope it stands for someone of courage who will do battle. The name DeGuerin is French, and it comes from the root word guerre, G-U-E-R. And my brother disagrees about how to spell it, but
we know he doesn't know how to spell.
But it means warrior. I don't think that shaped my personality or anything, but I like that name. And what I've tried to stand for is a person who will fight. And you get that reputation, and it makes it easier for you. It makes it easier to deal with prosecutors who otherwise would just use the strength of their office to coerce a plea. That happens all the time.
How do you think, where do you see us going in the criminal justice system as lawyers, as criminal defense lawyers? Or where do you want us to go?
Well, I think one of the greatest trends is what's going on right here at the Rusty Duncan seminar, and that is more and more people are finding strength in numbers and in banding together, learning together, and taking the lessons that you learn from older lawyers back to your practice. I hope that what we're doing is instilling a fighting spirit in these lawyers. That's what I do with my class. I teach a law class at the University of Texas Law School, and I tell my students it's not a class in law or a class in procedure, it's a class in attitude. You have to take that attitude to what you do.
when Dick DeGuerin walks in the courtroom, what message do you want to send?
Hey, you better be ready, because I am.
And you are. Dick, thank you very much.
Thank you, Stan. Okay.
That was wonderful.
Thank you.
That was great, Dick. Thank you.
That's fine.